Well, anyway, good afternoon. Welcome to the sixth and penultimate talk in the lecture series on global populism. My name is Daniel Kinderman. I teach political science and international relations and direct European studies here at UD, and I organize this lecture series. And I'm delighted to see you here. I know you're very busy, have many other things to attend to, so it's wonderful to see you here. And I'd also like to thank everyone from within the university here for all the support that made this lecture series possible and made it possible for me to invite people such as Professor Berezin here from Cornell University. Populism remains an important force in politics in the world. I think that much is clear looking at recent elections, including the election in Germany, where the AfD is now the largest opposition party, and I fear, or I don't fear, but I suspect they will probably grow in strength given that they have a new version of the Große Koalition, of the big coalition. Obviously, in the most recent election in Italy, the populists did very, very well as well. And this provides an excellent justification for bringing a leading expert on populism in Europe to us here in order to really gain insight into these developments. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Mabel Berezin from Cornell University. She did her PhD at Harvard and has written a number of very important works in this area. Her first important book in this area was Illiberal Politics, was actually a book on making the fascist self, the political culture of interwar Italy. Sorry, got the order mixed up. Then Illiberal Politics in Neoliberal Times, Culture, Security, and Populism in the New Europe. And I believe in your talk, you're going to give us a glimpse into a new book project that is evolving and that will take shape next year when you're at Princeton. And this new book project here is entitled The End of Security and the Discovery of Global Populism. So welcome to the University of Delaware, and thank you so much for coming, Mabel. We look forward to your talk.
Okay. Okay, I want to thank Daniel Kinderman for his very kind and generous introduction and for inviting me here today to deliver a lecture in this very exciting series that he's organized, and of course on this very important topic. And it's particularly gratifying to be here because I always love to come to places where I can see Cornell graduate students who are now faculty members and sort of advance themselves in the world. So it's a very nice moment. I'm very excited to share my ongoing populist project with you. As Daniel has noted here, for virtually my entire academic career, I have written on fascism and extreme nationalism, but as a cautionary tale, not as a current event. Until a few short years ago, I had to convince my audiences that the nationalist right, which is my preferred term, was a serious phenomenon worthy of analytic consideration. Now populism appears as late-breaking news, not necessarily social science, and everyone from pundits to academics agrees that it is worthy of analysis. In 2017, fueled by Brexit in June 2016, and then Trump in November, populism became the word du jour among academics and the media. A newness narrative developed. That is, a discussion of populism emerged as though it had never existed before 2016. And a sort of companion narrative to the newness narrative was a kind of how did this happen narrative, or how did this happen question. By spring 2017, populism was all over the news. American cable news began talking about the Dutch elections in March, elections which barely merited a blink on the sort of American media landscape the last time there were Dutch elections in 2012, parliamentary elections, that is. Marine Le Pen so infiltrated American media that pundits on CNBC, the financial news channel, regularly mentioned the 2027 French presidential election in ominous terms. A recent PwC organization poll of global CEOs shows that when asked to rank order what they perceive as threats to business climate in various world regions, populism came in as number 1 in Western Europe among 42% of the respondents. Now, just as quickly as the newness narrative emerged in the media and among academics, a second narrative emerged, what I call the sort of end of populism narrative. In part, this was triggered by the election of Emmanuel Macron in France as French president in spring 2017, and at that time he was widely viewed as beating back the right-wing xenophobic forces of Marine Le Pen. So by June, we can read things like Nate Silver on his 528 blog, surveying the 2017 elections in Europe, not his usual field, and asking questions, is Donald Trump making Europe liberal again? And in that article, Silver argued that the data shows, and he's looking actually the third round of the Austrian presidential election, which had occurred in December 2016. So he's doing this survey from these Austrian elections in December 2016 to the French. The French presidential election comes first, and then the French legislative elections. So he's going from December 2016 to June 2017, and he's saying happily that the people have turned away from populism. And on a lighter note, in June 2017 again, French political scientist Dominique Morcy, writing on Project Syndicate, tells us talks about the changing geopolitics of European emotion. And he talks about a new triangle of geopolitical emotion that has emerged in Europe. Great Britain has ceased feeling superior to France. France has stopped feeling inferior to Germany. Well, I guess he would say that since he is a French political scientist. But at any rate, if 2016 was the year of voting dangerously, then 2017 at first appeared to be the year of voting cautiously. Until fall 2017, when the right-wing Alternative for Germany came in third place in the German parliamentary elections, and the Austrian Freedom Party, they sort of dodged a bullet with the presidential election. This Freedom Party is the right-wing party in Austria, achieved the same number of votes as the Social Democrats and is now a part of the Austrian governing coalition. And of course, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, we just had Italy, where the entire political system imploded and left and right populists are currently vying with each other to form a government. So the end of populism narrative was, or is, as events show, as somewhat as flawed as the newness narrative. And what I will do in this talk is to try to place the political phenomenon that these two narratives capture, that is the newness of populism and the end of populism, in the broader context of European political and cultural development. I will draw upon what I've learned and thought, beginning with my work on the 1930s Italian fascism, as well as my work on contemporary iterations of the right. And my talk today specifically draws on work that I have been pursuing for the last few years that is a kind of what I call a comparative history of the present, in the sense that I'm trying to create a comparative historical account of what I describe as illiberal or extreme nationalist politics in contemporary Europe, mainly focused on what we used to call Western Europe. Now, there's much to be said about Eastern Europe, but that's not part of my story. My overarching storyline begins roughly in 2009, which I mark as the beginning of a new trajectory, a new period in the trajectory of European nationalist right parties. Although today I will focus more narrowly on events between roughly 2015 and today. As you'll see as my talk progresses, I view the year 2015 as a tipping point in the trajectory of right nationalist parties in Europe. Now, in social science terms, my unit of analysis is the phenomenon of right nationalism rather than a specific nation state, although of course I will refer to individual nation states to make illustrative points. An implicit part of my talk is why analysts missed or underestimated the nationalist right phenomenon, which is why I've called the talk Attention Deficits. And basically what I'm going to present here is a historical argument. Just a brief excursus on terminology, which we can come back to in the question and answer period, but I basically prefer to use the term illiberal, which I did not take from Viktor Orban. I originally took it from Stephen Holmes, who wrote a book on anti-liberalism. I would rather use that term or extreme nationalism. I prefer those terms because the phenomenon I'm examining have actually occurred in procedurally democratic states, and I also think that there are lots of problems with the term populism as it's a term that explains both too much and too little at the same time. So I'm going to skip over the terminology, and we can go back to that in the questioning if people are interested in pursuing that line. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is take two sort of paths by way of background to this talk. And the first thing I want to do is to talk about who are the nationalist right. I'm assuming that many of you will know who they are and many of you will not. So I'm going to actually, I have some slides here that sort of display, as it were, the cast of characters that I'm going to be talking about. The first image is of the Golden Dawn. Can you see this, or is it too light in this room? I don't know how it's projecting. This is the extreme right Greek party. They are in the Greek parliament. They're a very small section of the Greek parliament. They had a kind of breakthrough in the 2012 Greek parliamentary election. I put them up here because when people talk about populists in Europe, I think this is the image they have in mind. This is a very 1930s kind of image, the fist. And these guys are actually pretty tough, and they are actually pretty xenophobic and Nazi in their orientation. But they are basically not major players, even though this is the image that people tend to carry around when they talk about these things. Second person, again, this is my not so random collection, but Geert Wilders, leader of the Dutch Freedom Party. He's well known, aside for his shock of blonde hair. Basically, he's always in and out of government. He's the person who actually came in third in the parliamentary elections in March. He's most known for his very strict anti-Muslim stance, and he believes he has to defend Western civilization. And the image, the cartoon of the Dutch, copying the Dutch boy putting his hand in the dike to keep the country from flooding. A more well-known, or at least well-known in terms of press coverage, is Marine Le Pen. I have a sort of archive of photos of Marine Le Pen. This is Marine Le Pen in 2014. It is before the European parliamentary elections, and it's a very good image when talking about attention deficits because the French National Front came in first in the 2014 French parliamentary elections, and people sort of didn't notice, or when it happened, people said, "Oh well, you know, it doesn't really mean anything." Basically, she was going up and up and up in the polls, and it was sort of like it sort of was something that people were blocking out, almost like a psychological thing. It's an important picture because she does have, until a point, an upward trajectory. Who is she? She's the leader of the French National Front. She has been since 2011. She is the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was the original founder of the French National Front. What's important about Marine Le Pen, aside from her key position in France, is that in the years between, say, I would even say 2011 and today, she's had 2 sort of op-eds on the editorial page of the New York Times. She spoke to the Oxford Student Union in 2015. Time magazine twice made her among the 100 most influential people of the year. The last time they did it was in I guess it was 2015, and she shared that honor with Thomas Piketty, which is a sort of irony, as it were. And when in the run-up to the presidential campaign last spring, that we're up to spring 2017, she had a live interview on CNN with Anderson Cooper in which she talked about the perils of savage globalization. And she set this tone in Europe in her concession speech to Macron last May about the future, where she linked the future of Europe and globalization. She talked about the future being a struggle between globalists and nationalists. Now, this wasn't new. This is a theme that had been percolating for a long time, but she sort of really nailed it and encapsulated it at that moment as she was doing her concession speech. She had an upward trajectory from 2012. She came in strong in the 2012 presidential election. She came in 3rd. Where she made it to the 2nd round in April a year ago. She was never projected to win, although there was a kind of mass hysteria that suddenly developed around her, both in the, as I said, the business press in the United States, but also in France. And it had been clear, if one were looking, that she had been doing quite well and capturing the attention of the French people. She did do worse than was expected against Macron, and there was some sense that she would be departing from the French political scene. Of course, that's not the case. She was never about to depart. Here she is campaigning last year. She was going to put France in order in 5 years. But she has the party just had a meeting last weekend, and she's on a roll again, she occasionally does bad strategic decisions, one of which was to invite, I would call this a strategically bad decision, to invite Steve Bannon, who proudly told the assembled masses, let them call you racist, who cares? Not a good strategy for somebody whose main point for the last, at least since she became head in 2011, was to de-demonize the party. So I'm not exactly sure what she was thinking there, but probably not good things. Although Steve Bannon has been on a tour of Europe for the last month or so, trying to sort of join forces with European populists or nationalists. She is now no longer alone. This is a kind of change. There was a big meeting in Prague. You'll recognize some of these people. I believe that's the German woman. Does anybody know that is the German woman that she's standing next to? And there's the Italian Lega man, and of course Wilders keeps coming back. None of these people ever go away. They are now friends. This is December 2016, and what their theme was, you can see again Wilders and Le Pen, for a Europe of sovereign nations. So it's the anti-globalization, and this was actually why I wrote it on top of the slide. It was actually Wilders' theme, and he sort of announced it in September. So they're sort of moving together, as it were. And then these other, you have to sort of put Italy up here. These are new political actors that were never on anybody's imaginative screen. This is 5-star, and it's unclear that they are actually the right. It's unclear exactly what they are. Beppe Grillo, the founder, I guess he's some kind of an entertainer, and this is the new, 31-year-old leader of the party, who, in theory, could become Prime Minister of Italy. And just to sort of give a sense of the voting in Italy, I put this up because this is going to speak to a theme that I'm going to be developing in the course of my lecture. This is very graphic, not totally finely grained, but yellow is 5-star, which is basically sort of almost an anarchist party in some ways. Center left, the traditional you know, the remnants of what was the left in Italy. It's a coalition of parties. Center-right is mainly the very sort of xenophobic League and some of Silvio Berlusconi. But you could see the country is divided in half between the extreme forces, the conservative right, the whatever that yellow, the 5-star is, and that's yet to be figured out. And look at the old red part of Italy, shrunk to virtually nothing, only hanging in its old core locations. Italy used to be like considered one of the reliable red countries for those who studied comparative politics, at least when I was starting out, which was, I admit, a while ago. So lots of changes and lots of people in this cast of characters. So that's the first thing I wanted to put up by way of background, so you have some images in your head as I move forward. And the second thing I want to do is I want to review some themes that I developed in my book, Illiberal Politics. And some of these themes, the book was written in 2009, and some of these themes, when I wrote the book, seemed entirely speculative. And what seemed speculative in 2009 seems predictive to me now. So let me sort of go over some of them. First, the principal argument of illiberal politics was that the increasing presence of the nationalist right, particularly in France, was due to increasing Europeanization and not immigration, as more standard accounts argued, or that immigration was perhaps necessary, but it was certainly not sufficient to explain the increasing salience of the French right, and in some instances also European right. I argued that political scientists mainly were who I was arguing with at the time, but the arena of people who were interested in the nationalist right has grown. But at any rate, my argument was that by focusing on immigration alone, one missed other social, economic, and cultural phenomena that were impacting European social and political arrangements and were driving right nationalist impulses across the continent. And I have to say, I always was very careful with the language that I used to describe this, and I used the term impulses, because at that point, again, people weren't, these parties were not winning elections. They weren't part of governing coalitions. Again, in this book, I identified 3 factors, which I believe are important to foreground here and to keep them in mind as I go forward. First, the pace of the problem with Europeanization, otherwise today more commonly referred to in the meaning is slided between the two, globalization. When they say globalization, when Marine Le Pen says globalization, she's thinking as much about the EU as she's thinking about trade with China or something like that. The pace of Europeanization and popular resistance to it, which was on the continent way before 2018 or 2017. One only has to think about 2005, when both France and the Netherlands rejected the European Constitution. In the year 2000, when the Treaty of Nice was actually instituted by the EU, there were massive protests. In the year 2000, the group Attack, which was an anti-globalization movement that is somewhat diminished in impact now, was first founded. And there was this general kind of animus against Brussels that was developing in the conversations and the public discourse of both actually left and right, out of the mainstream parties. Basically, one of the things that was coming to the fore at that moment was that the collapse of traditional economic arrangements without replacements, or at least replacements for the kinds of persons who could not participate in the mobility opportunities that EU promised to the young and the educated. So it was these kinds of people that were actually the core of this beginning attraction, as it were, to these parties at that point of both the left and the right. So that's the first point. The second is, and these points are somewhat interrelated, a decline of the traditional left and the absence of a viable political alternative. So on one hand, you have the absence of an economic alternative for people who were sort of de-skilled, but you also have the absence of a political alternative that supported the interests of people who do not participate in the sort of mobile, transnational, global Europe. These are the same groups that were very much attracted to Brexit, the so-called rural people in the United States. And in confronting this issue of these particular social groups and how to best represent them, basically it was very difficult to tell the difference between the established left and the center-right, because both groups basically supported EU. And EU and all that meant was basically one of the factors that was responsible for the marginalization of these groups. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is what I call the attenuation of fixed security. And what this is about is that basically the nation state provided what a trans-European polity could not. And when I say the nation state provided something, I don't mean it simply provided identity, which is often the way people talk about this, but it also provided institutions that embedded citizens in their national spaces, institutions such as social welfare, labor market protection, as well as things like citizenship, language, religion, common religion, even if people don't practice it. So there was a kind of commonality that worked its way out in various ways, all of which is basically gone in many ways. So when I completed illiberal politics, as I said, these were speculative to me at the time. I started the book with the decline of the traditional left, but I was basically certain that the nationalist right in France and elsewhere would never get much of a political foothold in Europe, and I imagined that the center-right would dominate European politics. As I was finishing the first draft of the book, Nicolas Sarkozy was elected president of France on a platform that tried to outfront the National Front on most issues, except the issue of Europe, of which both center-left and center-right was deeply committed. Jean-Marie Le Pen, longstanding leader of the National Front, came in fourth in that 2007 presidential election, and he departed the French political stage grumbling that the Front had won the battle of ideas, if not the election. And his point was basically that National Front ideas were becoming mainstream, so the French in general could elect more palatable right-wing or rightish-leaning candidates. Now, that's not what happened, obviously. If we stopped there, that would be the end of the story. And if we can imagine a world where time had stopped in 2007 or 2008, then there probably would not have been a nationalist populist moment. There probably would have been this firmly center-right Europe with a quiescent triumph of neoliberalism, or whatever word you want to use for that phenomenon. And right-wing nationalist parties might have continued to be a present but non-consequential residual element of the European political landscape. But time does not stop. Time did not stop in 2008. And what neither I nor others anticipated was the European sovereign debt crisis, or the euro crisis. And this crisis, I argue, produced a sea change in the European political, cultural, and economic landscape. Before 2009, it would have been impossible for national leaders and politicians, as well as academics who study Europe and European integration, to imagine the collective sense of insecurity that the sovereign debt crisis, which began, I date it to 2009 with the restructuring of Hungarian debt, and then its subsequent acceleration, that insecurity or the intense reaction against Europe writ large that the debt crisis generated actually propelled nationalist parties forward beginning in 2009. And the first place you can see this is in the European parliamentary elections, where the European left crashed. I mean, not anywhere crashed to the extent it has today, and the center-right dominated, and the nationalist right began to acquire political legitimacy as well as seats in the European Parliament. I have to ask your forgiveness because I realized I did have an image about the failure of the left, and this is an image from France, but it actually is, since I'm at a temporal break here, it is it more or less has a lot of what's going on, has been going on across Europe. This is the 2012 election, Hollande and Sarkozy, who came in sort of neck and neck, in Verona probably, home of Romeo and Juliet. And these are workers. This is the problem now across Europe. Who represents these people? These are National Front people, because Marine Le Pen came in third. They're at the home of the National Front on a tower, being courted by both of them. And the workers are saying, who are these people? Do you know them? I've never seen them before. And the cartoon is based on France, but it basically, in many ways, could work for all of Europe in regard to the traditional left. Okay, so we reach this historical conjuncture that something happens. You have this crisis event, and things start to change. So and it is at this crisis that the two threads of my story come together, and I have my attention deficits here. There are two threads of the story I want to tell you today. One, I want to look at continuities that addresses this newness narrative, and obviously I don't think there is anything new here. And then I want to look at contingencies, and that is the power of events to actually tip politics in different directions. And basically the point is that these were there all along. The continuities were there all along, and because of the attention deficits, you have a vulnerability to contingencies. So basically, my general point is that the nationalist right, the continuity of the nationalist right, intersected with what I call the triple crises of austerity, that's the Euro crisis, security, that's terror, and migration. And this is how I'm going to focus on both of these for the next part of the talk. So first, I want to look at the newness narrative, and I don't obviously believe that it's new, and I want to look at continuities because I think the continuities are very important. And I think continuities is central to understanding the contemporary political landscape, because I think it's also an important part of what people have missed. Continuity can be documented, and I will show you some continuities. What is new and what we need to think about is the speed of events, and there really has been the time between 2015 and today is really a very short historical time frame. So it's very worth thinking about in terms of what's sort of pushing this speed. And I could just give you a laundry list of some of the things, such as, you know, the Austrian presidential election, the first German regional elections, Brexit, events in Poland and Hungary, even though I'm looking at the West, Trump in the United States, Austrian elections, German elections, Italian elections. Things are sort of moving in fast forward. So my argument is that Europe is experiencing a political moment where trajectory has met opportunity, and we basically have a collision of continuity and contingency of events that have acted as accelerants, this is the key point, on party institutions and in some instances extra-parliamentary movements that were already in place. So it's important to recognize continuity going forward. Or to put more specifically, the normalization of the nationalist right is the principal collateral damage from the European sovereign debt crisis, the first crisis that gave the nationalist right momentum across Europe and fueled the already existing flames of anti-Europe sentiment. Then the refugee crisis followed, the terror or the security crisis, and you get the perfect storm which tips the electoral scales and the political scales in the national right dimensions. So let's go over I think it's important to see this visually. So let's go over the continuities first. And what I want to show you now is the trajectory of right-wing parties in Western Europe. And what I'm going to show you is some graphs that I have created with research assistants. And basically, they're European parliamentary elections that go from 1970 to 2014. It's 188 elections. And I picked a series, I didn't really pick them, I developed what I called a consensus of experts. I took books that were sort of books on, with titles such as Right-Wing Parties in Europe, people like Piero Ignazi, Herbert Kitchell, these are all experts, Kosmuda, David Art, they all wrote, there were many more of them, that wrote summary books on the right. And I developed a list of parties that these experts could agree were right-wing parties. And I then went to two sources. One, this web source, which had up to at least 2014 most of the European elections, although we did have to actually go to individual parliamentary websites. Ministries of Interior usually have the data for this. But I also went to a printed source that went way back to, it went back to the pre-World War I period. And this is interesting. As some of you may have seen, the New York Times every now and then had these like red slots. I mean, anybody who's sort of been following this, they had these red bar graphs. But they started in 1990 in part because they have a really good staff and a lot of money, but they also do, more than I have, but they also have this capacity to go into these data sources. I think it's more interesting in some ways to look at this if you go back to 1970, which is where my data goes back to. And what I did was I basically wanted to see, I go back to 1970 because I think that's an important part. It's sort of the part we can start talking about the end of the post-war period. It's the first global, it's the first Gulf oil crisis, the end of a lot of things. And basically, I tried, and we're going to redo these again because I'm determined to get them to be visual works of art as well as interpretively. But basically, I tried to drop bar graphs on certain periods that I thought were really, where I could see sort of changes. Now, this is not anything that's, it's not put into any kind of a, for those of you who are social scientists, it's not put into any kind of a regression module. It's purely descriptive, and some of the data points include more than one party. So it's not like just, because there are a few places where there are several of these right-wing parties. Not many, but at any rate. But the key period that I wanted to really look at was the post-2009 period, because I was engaged in many arguments, which I don't have to engage in anymore, with, again, political scientists to try to say that something was going on that was qualitatively different after the financial crisis hit. So I'll show you the whole map, all of them at once, so you get the sort of visual hit. And then I want to break them off. Basically, this is the core of what was, again, Western Europe. The East would be more difficult to map for lots of different reasons. There you have them all together. I want to break them apart a little bit. But there's one thing, again, as I said, these are visuals. The first thing you do see, if you just look across most of them, is that there isn't that much, with some exceptions, and we will talk about the exceptions, there isn't a lot of right-wing presence in that kind of 70 to 80 period, okay? So the first thing I always like to talk about is the Nordic States, because the Nordic States are often considered the big social welfare states, and right-wing politics, it's sort of antithetical to everything we think about the Nordic States. But indeed, particularly if you look at Norway and Denmark, there's a long-standing trajectory way before the 80s, certainly, of right-wing parties, and they're only getting stronger as time goes on. What is interesting is Finland, who at this point, had a kind of spike. It was definitely, there's a party called the True Finns that definitely had an upward tick after the financial crisis. And a very interesting case here is Sweden, which has this party called the Sweden Democrats. They've always had a few sort of nationalist right parties, but they had this party called they still have this party called the Sweden Democrats, which was, by 2014 was getting extremely strong and is still a presence in Sweden. So the takeaway point here is that there's more of these parties in existence than people tended to think about. Now, I'm talking generally because every one of these countries has their own individual national histories that vary, that impact upon this, but I'm being broad here. The second is the Mediterranean, and Spain and Portugal, virtually empty. You know, they might have some tiny right-wing movement somewhere. Greece, again, Greece was mainly left. These are mainly left. Greece was totally left until the 2012 upward thing is really the presence of this Golden Dawn. And Greece's politics went with Cyprus, basically went left. Italy, whenever I present this, I always say, well, Italy is just like crazy, and that's not an analytic concept, crazy. But the thing, and here I am again. I can really tell you, Italy is crazy. You know, they just had a total, or they might be. I'm never sure if Italy is crazy or if they're in the avant-garde, because they just totally got rid of their center. Oh, you're all right. Somebody just, that's okay. Somebody just got rid of. They just got rid of their center left and their center right, and you know they've only got the extremes. I don't know how to map them, and actually, I had undergraduates. We were working in these parties. It's very hard to map Italy in this thing because their parties have been changing so much. But that's a pattern. Northern Europe. Okay, again, Austria wasn't such a big surprise, really, when the Freedom Party came along. Austria has quite a strong history of right-wingism. Netherlands, an up and down kind of relationship, but I guess in Netherlands the pattern does sort of hold that it doesn't really come out until the late 80s, when these things are starting to percolate across the continent. The interesting thing is that this chart, although I hadn't intended it that way, Germany and England used to be the outliers in this, but they also now are graphs of political rupture, that visualizations, in part because you get UKIP, which I'm not sure exactly how you want to really classify that party, but it's certainly, if you look, and you know, we painfully put in all the codes on all these different elections. There virtually is nothing to code, you know, or you're coding like 0%, you know, percent, or 0.08 or 0.05. And Germany was the same thing, although they had sort of they had small right-wing parties, but they basically had virtually, you know, they were always there, but they virtually had no presence. And there was a lot of, I can talk about why I think that happened. I mean, I think the rupture in Germany, I mean, is really the power of the past isn't holding the same way it used to, and we can talk about that. And then the last countries that I want to look at, again, Belgium, long tail on that, some spiking up there. Belgium is kind of difficult to sort of figure out. Switzerland always has some kind of a right-wing party, and it's not really in the game because it's not in EU. And then France, of course, has this really odd two-tier legislative system, and these are the parliamentary elections, not the presidential. But you can see that, you know, it went up in the late 90s when Jean-Marie Le Pen was doing really well. And it's not that the French National Front has held so many seats in the French parliament, dipped right down after Sarkozy 2007, and then started to climb up in 2012. Then the next legislative election was this past spring. Okay, so what we do have here is basically a definite pattern. There's a lot to basically work with there. And the graphs do capture trajectories, continuities, and now I would even argue ruptures in the light of what we have seen happen in Germany, particularly in Germany, actually, and in Italy too, although I'm not sure how we'll ever get Italy into this graph in a meaningful way, or in a visually meaningful way. Now, what the graphs did not capture is the volatility in recent elections, what the late political scientist Peter Mayer has labeled ruling the void. That is this kind of shakiness almost, shaky polls that don't reflect anything, groups that seem to go back and forth among different kinds of political parties. The other things the graphs do not capture is the classic left parties. And I do have another data set just like this that includes the left. And basically, what it allows me to sort of show visually, although I haven't been showing it in my talks, is that as the nationalist right gets stronger, the institutionalist left gets weaker. And of course, these charts don't take into account presidential elections. But the graphs or the charts do certainly contradict the newness narratives. It does show you that there are continuities, that there are ruptures, and it sort of points in the direction of theorizing the speed. Why is everything sort of just suddenly starting to go forward with this kind of speed, by which parties and movements that had basically seemed peripheral both in the political sphere of the countries that they were part of, but also among the scholars who actually studied these. I mean, oftentimes people said it was career death if you were a political scientist to study, any of these parties. Wouldn't you agree with it? It wasn't the hottest topic around. Now every graduate student I meet seems to want to study these things. But at any rate, so you've got this moment here I will argue in a minute, 2015, where opportunity, continuity intersects with events. And I think the events here are actually what's crucial here, and then the failure to deal with some of the events. So I want to turn to what I call the three crises of 2015, this terror or security crisis, the continuing austerity crisis, and the refugee crisis. These crises, I argue, drove and continue to drive the erratic and unexpected political events in 2016 and beyond. And, just all of them, Brexit, Austria, Wilders. And these crises drive events with different valences in different countries, different causalities. But they certainly helped propel Marine Le Pen into the second round, if not the presidency of France. And I'm sure that they've certainly helped the careers and the trajectories of the right-wing parties in Austria and Germany and even in Italy. So just to remind you, January 2015 began with the most dramatic act of terrorism in Paris, Charlie. It was all basically over the news. It was all over, people were all over the streets of Paris. And it was a horrific event. At that moment, I wrote an article, a journalistic article, and I described it as a Sarajevo moment, because I really sensed it was a tipping point moment. And I don't have to tell you the history of what Sarajevo means, but as a contemporary metaphor, I saw it more about potentialities, not certainties, because I certainly didn't imagine, what was going to come before us in the next 3 years. And I was thinking that events in Europe had reached a potential tipping point that would at best result in a nationalist center turn, or at worst, produce political instabilities of a type that resembled, but only resembled, because we can't go back to World War I or the 1920s and 30s. We're not going to get totalitarian regimes, although we may not like them. But it was producing, it was setting events in motion that could not end well if they were not dealt with properly. Charlie was only the beginning. 2015 was a year of potential tipping points. 2015, I have to remind you, ended, I feel like I've lost the page, ended with the Bataclan events in Paris. But before December 2015, we had July 2015 in Greece, and although events couldn't be more different, they represent emotional tipping points in rather similar ways. Basically, for those of you who do not remember, Greece, the EU imposed austerity, created riots in the streets. The story basically was Cyprius, the prime minister of Greece, basically routed the center and austerity party in January, and he was going to broker a deal with Angela Merkel and Wolfgang Schäuble, but unfortunately he did not broker the favorable deal he thought he was going to broker. He called a referendum. Politicians in Europe should not be calling referendums. Have any of them ended well in the past 30 years, come to think of it? That's an article in itself, politicians and their bad referenda. Anyway, on July 5th, and the Greeks overwhelmingly voted no, as you probably remember if you're in this room. But what was interesting about it was that Marine Le Pen at that time said Cyprius was the only politician in Europe with political will, and she had a second in command at the time that described EU as representing the slavery of an entire people. And when a week later there was this harsh bailout agreement, the trending hashtag on Twitter was "This is a coup." And there were demonstrations in the streets in the streets of Greece. And I remember at the time Paul Krugman, who I'm quite fond of his writings on Europe, actually was sort of posted a very passionate op-ed in the New York Times, crying about what could possibly happen and being concerned about the worst. Worst meaning always some kind of a 1930s return. So although these two have nothing, in theory, some could look at this and say they have nothing to do with each other, I would contend they have a lot to do with each other. First of all, they're very, very public events. We saw lots of pictures. Everybody saw lots of pictures. If we saw them in the United States, they saw even more in Europe. The debt crisis and the austerity regimes created a collective immiseration of the population that was intense in Greece, although it was not unique to Greece. And there is a well-documented suicide epidemic in Greece that is attributed to the debt crisis. Now, the second half of 2015 was not much better than the first half because it brought into focus the third crisis, which started earlier in the spring. And this third crisis was the worst asylum and humanitarian crisis since World War II, coupled with the ongoing concerns that have been in all these countries over integration and religion. And the crisis, I would contend that the migration crisis, more than the others almost, reached a wide public because of social media and all sorts of media. I cannot bring myself to put that particular image up, but can anybody forget the images of the dead child or the dead people trying to get into Europe, images of people on the beach? Lots of these images circulated, and they circulated very widely, and they have a cognitive and emotional impact. And again, these were all over the place. This is a poster that UKIP used for the referendum, and it's called Breaking Point. The EU has failed us. This is the Brexit referendum. The Brexit referendum really didn't have anything to do with hordes. This had nothing to do with Britain. None of these people were coming into Britain, but this was one of the really popular posters at the time. So anyway, if things weren't bad enough, basically, this is how 2015 ended. The murders in Paris again. And less than a month later, this was November 13th, less than a month later, Marine Le Pen's National Front won 6 regions in the first round of the regional elections. Now, because the French are better at maneuvering and actually coming together to get to maneuver people out of the way, she did manage the Socialist Party, by agreeing to team up with some other parties, did manage to let her go from her 6-region almost victory to a 6-region defeat. And that, again, Marine Le Pen just keeps coming back and back and back. She just never, like the whale or the shark in Jaws or something. She just, it's never safe to go back in the water, as I showed you with the pictures earlier. But everybody seems to think she's gone for good, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. At any rate, all 3 of these crises have created, that is austerity, debt, security, refugee, have created a powerful negative synergy, and the main collective vehicle for ameliorating these crises, the EU, has proven ineffective not only at solving them, but even managing them. An EU that I argued in my earlier work, which was one of the reasons why I started with the older book, never enjoyed the wide support that elites thought it did. So basically, the sovereign debt crisis, the migration crisis, the security crisis have provided an opening for right nationalist parties, an opening that already that existed to mobilize nationalist feelings that were already there. And all three of these crises, the austerity, the security, the migration, they all flooded the European media and the blogosphere, and there were many different images of fear, images of predictions of disintegration, and all kinds of sort of frightening almost tropes from both the left, the right, and just about everybody, because the images were there. This is actually one of Marine Le Pen's campaign posters. I choose Marine, and look what the images are. They're all the sort of different attacks, presumably by Muslim terrorists, Islamic terrorists, and she's starting with the World Trade Center, the Boston Marathon, and there you have them. So here we are, and I'm moving towards my conclusion. We're in 2018, Brexit is gone, we have Trump. I keep mentioning Trump, even though he's not part of my story here, but he almost cannot be not mentioned because most people throw him in the sort of bouillabaisse here. Marine Le Pen, I've always contended she's not going anywhere. Neither is the European nationalist right. We have another kind of dissolution of democracy in Hungary and Poland. We have Turkey, we have Putin. The events of 2015, the tipping point events of 2015, live on and shape our current events. Populism has certainly not been defeated. And this is a cover that I think is a cover from The Economist for a year ago. And I think it's the wrong cover in many ways, because I'm not sure I would keep Marine Le Pen in the middle. But certainly, even though all these people, I thought they were sort of in the social science way, you're not supposed to compare apples and oranges, and this I always felt was apples, oranges, and pears. But basically, these two may be more connected than we realize, and not because of their politics. So I'll just leave that up. I'm not sure who we might want to put in that picture today. But let me end now with three broader points that I believe should govern our understanding and research moving forward. I do not, of course you probably have guessed this or not guessed it, I've said it millions of times here, I do not accept the end of populism narrative, and I doubt anybody else would at this moment. So what do we do? How do we think about this moving forward? The first thing is research. And one thing I think we need to do in thinking about these parties and movements is what I call sort of abandoning our original sin and Munich moment as ways of talking about the nationalist right. Original sin, basically, that these parties are prisoners of their past or their origins. In other words, it's not helpful to think about the Freedom Party in Austria simply as a party that was originally founded by a Nazi. It's not helpful to think about Marine Le Pen simply in terms of her father. These are current realities. So that's the original sin notion. And then the Munich moment part of it is, do we think that they're not, it's an open question what they're going to do when they get into office. And I think that that's something we have to think about as researchers, because I think to go in that direction of, well, they're like this and they're going to do that, takes us away from, I think, the reasons that people are actually gravitating towards them. If we just sort of say, well, they're Nazis, or they were Nazis, or they came from Nazis, it sort of blocks our thinking about, well, where did they really come from? And I think it's one of the reasons as again, I'm getting to really like my attention deficit. And a really good example of what I'm talking about, before I came here, I was reading my Twitter feed, and Marine Le Pen herself came up with the following, in that very ill-chosen, as again, I really do think having Bannon there, if she has any political hopes, was not a good idea. But at any rate, she has changed the name of the National Front to the National Rally. And the National Popular Rally was a name that they gave to the sort of Vichy party, as I understand. So people are saying, well, look, she's obviously a Nazi, a fascist, exactly what I'm just saying, because she changed the name to National Rally. They forget that the Republican Party in France also was called Rally for the Republic, so that rally thing is often used. And she sort of said, not one journalist who's accusing me of being a fascist for saying this would ever accuse the Socialist Party of being fascist or being Nazis because they didn't, because of the connection to the Nationalist Socialist Party. And obviously, it's a battle of words. But I think there's a point here in the sense that it is important to kind of try to figure out what the moment is, because these parties, they didn't come from. They had a long history, as I tried to show, but it wasn't necessarily the 20s and 30s that they're coming from. They're coming from other events, other congruences of events that were occurring in the 50s, 60s, 70s in Europe. And in some of these nation states, again, this is why I said individual histories matter, the Nazi parties were outlawed. The Italian party had a sort of remnant of the fascist party. They had another name, the MSI. So it's complicated, but the simple back to the past or original sin language I do not think is analytically helpful. And I do think it gets in the way of us trying to deal with the important problems that are there. We basically have to take these nationalist parties for what they are now, a response to real problems. And particularly we have to look at the fact that established institutional venues, particularly center-left parties, have not done a very good job of handling these problems. Security is a major one. Marine Le Pen, the day after the November 13 shootings in Paris, said that France didn't feel safe to her. And the truth of the matter is, it's not that odd an idea to ordinary people, or to ordinary people when 7 months later holiday strollers were run over and killed on the promenade in Nice. It's not such a fascistic idea to say you don't feel safe when these things happen. So something has to be sort of, a kind of realistic reframing of problems has to occur. Again, I want to harp on the fact that basically there has been a failure of the institutionalized, traditionalized parties to deal with many of these problems. And that at this moment, Europe, and you could say the United States also, needs an alternative institutionalized party that acts like the European left used to act. European socialist parties today are as identified with austerity politics and EU policies as center-right parties. And I'm not prescribing what this alternative has to be. It doesn't necessarily have to be a left in the traditional left way. But it does have to be a party that is not so cosmopolitan that it appears to ignore the struggles of ordinary people. We'll see what happens with Macron in France, because he's obviously not an ordinary person, even though he won by a very broad number of people, in part as a reaction to people not wanting Marine Le Pen. And then, of course, the Italian elections. That'll be interesting to see what happens there. But the main thing for us to remember is that there's nothing tricky or conspiratorial here. It's not a plot. People are voting for these parties. They are democracies. And we have to sort of try to understand the space that the nationalist right has taken up and to try to sort of recalibrate what we mean by interests. Second point, and it's a quasi-policy point, but we have to beware in thinking about the current crises and this sort of, I'm sort of moving into the language of the populist wave. We have to be aware of going from what I call going from one utopia to another. I mean, we have to remember that EU started as a peace project when Winston Churchill stood on the steps of the church tower in Zurich. He was thinking about preventing war. Europe has gone way beyond that moment. We have cultural utopianism of someone like Jürgen Habermas on one hand, and you have this there's this kind of economic utopianism that Thomas Piketty has put forth in the summer of 2014. And then you have this kind of EU almost inertia. In 2015, Juncker, the president of the European Commission, wrote a white paper. He writes a white paper every year. And he said, time for honesty, unity and solidarity, more solidarity, totally misreading the mood at the moment in Europe, as I would argue Angela Merkel did when she opened Germany's borders. And his next white paper after his honesty paper basically sort of had 5 lukewarm scenarios for the future of Europe that kind of amounted to a sort of shrug of the shoulders. So that's an issue that needs to be, thought about. And lastly, as social scientist, I think it's important to recognize what I call the relationship between security and futurity. That is, as we move onwards in a global and transnational world, because no matter how many rural people, no matter how many people live in the countryside, we really, no matter how much backlash, we're really not going to go backwards. We're going to move forward in some way or another. Security and futurity are linked. And whether or not, we don't have to agree that globalization is savage and wild, as Marine Le Pen told Anderson Cooper, but we might heed the words of my sociological colleague Craig Calhoun, who in a small book called Nations Matter argues that nations are not moral mistakes. Nation states, they're still with us, provide some of this, what I call thick security, political through citizenship, cultural through religion, and I don't really mean religion in an exclusionary way here, language, and most importantly, social security and welfare state models. So security, economic, political, cultural, stabilizes meanings, creates solidarities, even among those who are different from each other, because security provides a stable narrative about the future, and it's the future that's key here, hope, and imagination. So what would thick security look like in what is becoming ever more a post-security polity? Well, a depressing feature of the European economy right now is not unemployment per se, but statistics on youth unemployment that are up in the double digits in Greece and Spain, and even in Italy certainly is another one of these countries, 37%, and these are the most recent OECD statistics, and 24.6% in France. And it's no one, and still that's the current statistic, so no wonder Marine Le Pen has a large constituency of the young, and she does have an extraordinary constituency of the young. A 2015 Pew study showed that in Germany, Italy, Greece, Poland, and France, over 50% of European millennials viewed success, translate that into a sense of the future, as totally out of their hands. This is not unique to Europe. We get statistics like this in the US. So basically, what do we do moving forward? Well, it is time to end World War I and World War II metaphors, even though I've used quite a few of them today. And policymakers and academics should do some serious thinking about new sources of collective social solidarity and resilience in a world that is radically altered technologically, demographically, and geopolitically, not only from 1914, but from 1933, 1968, and even 1989. And I always like to end my talks with a quote from John Maynard Keynes, in part because I think it captures the moment in so many ways and continues to capture the moment. This is from The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and he basically, the part of it that I'm not going to read the whole quote, but the events of the coming year will not be shaped by the deliberate acts of statesmen, but by the hidden currents flowing continually beneath the surface of political history, of which no one can predict the outcome. And the way we influence these hidden currents is by setting in motion those forces of instruction and imagination that will change opinion. These hidden currents are not so hidden lately, and until politicians, social scientists, policy analysis deal with some of these events, the nationalist right has just to show up, if not to win elections, but to define the boundaries of who enters the public sphere. Or another way to think of it, there's this blank coloring book of Europe that keeps getting filled in space by the right if we don't think of a way to stop it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mabel, for this extremely rich and fascinating talk, which I think provides a lot of food for thought. You wanted to mention your Twitter feed?
Oh, we were talking about how I tweet on contemporary politics. At Mabel Berezin. Follow me on Twitter if you're interested.
I'm sure there are a lot of questions here, so please go ahead.
Okay, should I just field them, and I'll just have to say you, because I saw your hand first and then yours, yeah.
Thank you for that talk. It was fascinating. So since you're towards the tail end of a series, we get to compare.
I'm sorry, about what?
I said, since you're towards the tail end of a series, we get to compare.
Oh.
And what strikes me about your talk is that I would have suspected, if I didn't know what your disciplinary background was, that you were a historian. And the reason for that is in part because I don't see a lot of social institutions and social networks playing a role in your story.
Yeah.
So I wonder if I can ask you about one aspect of that and see what you think. One of the things that I get it why the American Democratic Party doesn't represent workers, and that has a lot to do with the decline of the union movement, the labor union movement in the U.S.
Yeah.
So my question is not the labor union movement in Europe, especially Western Europe, stronger? Does it not have also very close institutional ties with the traditional parties of the left? And if so, how did labor lose its voice in the traditional center-left parties in Europe?
That's an interesting question. First of all, I just want to say I am like a historical sociologist, and my disposition is historical. Although I did mention institutions a few times in there, which you can also look at from a historical point of view. It's a really good question why the organized labor did not sort of lost its grip. I think it's not so much they lost their grip, but the parties themselves lost them, in the sense that a lot of the sort of socialist, like the French Socialist Party, the Italian Socialist Party, they became much more sort of focused on sort of technology and sort of what we call in the United States the sort of the cognitive labor, and less so on the kind of what their core labor was, which was basically industrial labor, which is also it's just also the old. Those old modes of making of production are as weakened in Europe as they are in the United States. So that's one thing. And labor, you are right that there is a culture of labor, but that's been sliding. It's been sliding for, I would say, about 30 years easily in Europe. And I mean, the two countries I know best basically are Italy and France, and it's really been diminishing, in part because the industrial base is gone, their constituency is gone, and then the kinds of parties that left parties became. They became very almost Americanized. I wrote this article on Trump when I talked about the sort of ideology of meritocracy that's defined a lot of the American public consciousness and practice since, say, the 1970s. And I think, the sort of career open to thinking as opposed to the career open to labor and things like that. And I think you get that in Europe also. And I think that the left was just, was representing a different kind of person, and their ties are there, but they're much more weakened. They're not like, they're not like joined at the hip, and they could, they could tell each other what to do, more or less. So that's one thing. And I think that a lot of these European left parties actually sort of weakened. It grew apart is almost a better word, thinking of a marriage or something. But it's basically they weakened their connections with labor in part because their constituency shifted. They didn't have people that were in these unions. And a lot of the union people, I'm just thinking of Italy now, I'm thinking out loud actually while you're asking that question, but they also have, a lot of them are public service unions, and they're always kind of fighting and causing strikes and things like that, and it's a different sort of venue basically. So I don't know if that, I have to think about that some more though. It is a good question, and they certainly have, I need a sharper reason, but it's something that I've like almost accepted, you know, and think about that. Yes. Well, I think you were the next. Yeah.
Right. So, I was thinking as you were describing, especially the Euro crisis of 2015 as this sort of watershed moment that put the wind in the sails and sort of brought the right nationalist movements over the hump. I would have thought that would have provided an opening for left-leaning populists as well as it was the case in the United States with Bernie Sanders. My field is Italian, so I could perhaps explain that the failure of the we'll say the original Italian left, the far Italian left, in terms of the of disorganization, in terms of disintegration. But I'm not familiar enough with the rest of the European political landscape to explain why these events you're describing didn't feed into a Bernie Sanders-esque moment.
Well, they did in a way. I mean, I'm trying to sort of get this whole European landscape. I mean, you did have, Mélenchon in France. You could say he was the Bernie Sanders moment. You did have more of that in Spain, the Podemos. Five Star was supposed to be sort of, we don't know what Five Star is, but the thing is that those movements, the nationalist right, the difference was that they were parties, so they could run. And these other things were not parties. Basically, they occupied public space. They may, they said, the other thing, it's not that they just occupied public space. I have a colleague, an anthropologist, who's studying what she calls the squares movements now in Barcelona and Paris. And basically, it was like youth coming into these public squares and saying, and that's the question, saying what? A lot of it, it's a little bit like the Occupy movement in New York. There's a statement of discontent, but there's not a directed program like the old communists used to have, basically. And that's one reason why there have been, Mélenchon is the most successful, and if you sort of look at his program, it's very similar to the National Front. I mean, they share a lot. Well, Bernie Sanders shared some things they don't like, too. So I think that's one of the main reasons that all of these left movements, they've been extra parliamentary, and these people already had parties, which is what I was illustrating. But I think more importantly than their institutional issues, it's also this problem that they have a sort of vagueness of what they want. When I was in Paris, I went to Paris for a couple of weeks around the elections last year, and I was trying to decide which rallies I wanted to go to, and I decided to let my friend, who is a dedicated old school leftist progressive anthropologist, I let her go to I told her she could tell me about some of the rallies, and I went to the National Front rally. And I said to her, well, the big deal for the first round of the presidential elections was what were you going to do to vote against Le Pen, or actually not for the first round, the second round when it was Le Pen versus, now my head is scrambling because I'm keeping all these elections. At one point, first or second, there was a decision as to whether or not you were going to, I guess, vote for Macron. Because people were, it was kind of, it wasn't, I mean, I go to Paris all the time, and I talk to people, and I say, oh, well, you know, what do you think of Marine Le Pen doing better? And, no, Marine Le Pen is nobody, you know, she's getting up and up and up in the polls. Suddenly, that week before the 2 weeks, you know, between the first and second round of the presidential election, people who were, you know, ignoring Marine Le Pen, saying she was nothing, suddenly they were acting like, oh, she's definitely going to win. You know, what am I going to do? You know, I'm ready to immigrate or something. You know, and you know, the numbers were never in that direction. So people were kind of worried. It wasn't worried that these Mélenchon supporters would vote for Marine Le Pen. The worry was that they wouldn't vote at all, and that would get her in, and there'd be another Brexit or Trump, and, you know, and stuff like that. The numbers never went in that direction. They were so far off, you know, in compared to, you know, the Brexit numbers were much closer. People simply weren't looking. And Trump, all right, I mean, I was totally convinced that Hillary was going to win too, but it's still, these numbers were much more, they were consistently solid. The French don't act that crazy, and any time that the Le Pens actually did make headways, they only got so far. So, but it was interesting because what she reported to me was these young people basically were saying that they felt the best thing to do was to vote for no one. And the older generation of activists were trying to convince them, you can't do that. You've got to get out there and vote for Macron, even if you have to, you know, hold a toothpick over your nose or whatever. So, so that's a problem because, and then I went to some rallies in my spare rally time, and there was a kind of emptiness. There was a kind of emptiness of purpose, is what I put it. So I don't think there's kind of good organizing on the left, and the institutionalized left, who are doing terribly right now, even though Angela Merkel did take them into the coalition. You know, they really have to go back to the drawing board if they're ever to have any say in any of these countries. So, any other questions? Yes. I think it was you.
I think you really hit the nail on the head with blaming 1980s neoliberalism for a lot of this. I feel like so much of this populism is basically all of that come home to roost. Do you think that the European Union can put neoliberalism behind it, or is neoliberalism kind of built into the fabric of what the European Union is? And so therefore, thinking about the future, is there hope that the European Union can save itself, save Europe?
What I find exasperating about the European Union, aside from neoliberalism, which seems to be what it's predicated on, I mean, is it seems incapable of taking the kinds of any actions, despite the way it's set up, the legal barriers and what the nation states are supposed to do, and it just seems it doesn't seem to take actions that address the problems. In other words, it seems to be somewhat caught between sort of standard kind of legal actions and then sort of utopian ideals, and the two seem to be like clashing with each other. I mean, the migration crisis is a great example because, and it doesn't answer your question on neoliberalism, but you know, this is something they should be able to help these national states deal with. And instead, it's turned into this huge moral and humanitarian crisis. I mean, simply, you've got all these people coming into Europe. They got to, if you're going to say, okay, we're opening the borders to everybody, then even if you're not Germany, you know, if you're just Europe, all right, let's figure out how to do this, you know. And instead, you get this kind of chaos. Let's take them all in and let's not regulate this. And if we try to regulate it, we are, you know, basically going back to World War II and sending boatloads of Jews back to the Nazis or something. There's a lot of schizophrenia, I think, in the kind of I don't know, ideology, thought processes, or whatever that collective body is in Brussels. And so I don't know. I mean, I would have hoped that they could have, I would have imagined, as the social scientist in me would have imagined, even the historian in me, that they would be, you know, doing more things. And they talk about more Europe, And then, you know, that doesn't seem to be the thought of the right political thought of the moment, but they seem kind of incapacitated. There seems just, my sense is there's a kind of incapacity there. Now, you know, you could go to an EU conference and I'm sure you'd get totally other things, but looking at it the way I'm looking at it, it just seems to me, you know, I don't see the actions coming, and that makes me wonder how long EU will be with us. I don't think it's easy to disentangle, maybe you know, it's not easy to disentangle EU, but one sort of does have to wonder. Yes?
Mabel, I really fundamentally agree with your presentation, so I don't really have any sort of challenges to your argument, because I think you're fundamentally correct. But I do have two questions. The first one sort of connects to what my colleague Stuart Kaufman asked, and that is, I'm aware of some evidence that suggests that there is growing support and substantial support for the nationalist right within organized labor. So I know evidence in Germany would suggest that the Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, the DGB, which is the largest union organization in Germany, about a substantial number of their members voted for the AfD, right, the sort of the right-wing populist party in the most recent elections, and the DGB knows it has quite a few trade union members and also even works councils who are openly supportive of the AfD. And they don't know how to deal with this problem. And I'm wondering, since you're an expert, not only sort of, you know what's going on in like other countries, you know, France, Italy, elsewhere, is this just a German story, or is there something?
Well, it's not just a German story.
Elsewhere in Europe, that you also have support for the populist, for the nationalist right within organized labor? That's my first
well, I'm guessing how I typically read this, the kinds of things that I'm reading, works that I'm reading, is that workers have been in support of these, the French, definitely. The workers have been in support of the French. Now, that's interesting. That distinction often doesn't come into the data that I'm looking at. But it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case, because some of those workers are surely in unions, what's left of them. And I think one of the interesting things about unions are institutions, they're organizations, right? But a lot of people, particularly people I've known who've studied, the communist parties of Europe, and they're all retired now and gone, or they're alive and with us, but they're not working so much anymore as academics because they're retired. But there was always an assumption in a lot of those studies that the workers not only, belong to these parties, or the unions, if they did was covered by a union, but that they also bought onto the ideology. And what I've been thinking about, and I haven't seen really any studies of this, because it's not the kind of question you would ask if the people who worry about the decline of the left typically don't ask whether or not people bought into the ideology. They almost assume that they did. But that ideology, has either been gone for a long time because it was very local. I don't know if any of you have ever read David Kurtzer, the anthropologist's book on Italian Communist Party and how they used to give, pasta at the annual festival. And you must know this, and the Festa di Umanità and things like that. And that brought the community together, so they liked the pasta as much as the ideology, the free food or whatever. But if that's not true, which I'm sure is not true, then why not vote for the AfD and also be a union member? Because being a union member doesn't mean that you sort of, are singing the Internationale and are committed to what was the ideology. Yes. So what is the second?
The second part?
There's a class.
There's a class
that should be here now.
Should be here now.
Okay.
All outside waiting.
Oh, really?
Oh my God.
We need to go.
We'll have to take this up over dinner.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.